Hello everyone, it's Saturday morning and the sun has been shining, but it's getting a little cloudy today. I wanted to continue our discussions from earlier in the week as we studied together Mark chapter 13. I hope you've had a good week. I know that it's been probably a trying week for everyone with the quarantine and all the daily news and updates from the state as well as from the federal government. We do live in a very difficult time, but I hope everyone is doing well, and I would like to encourage you to watch these videos that we put out just to help us stay connected with each other and hopefully help you in your spiritual life. I'm going to plan on doing something tomorrow morning, Sunday morning, on Zoom, and so be looking for an invitation to join us on Zoom in the morning, probably around 11 o'clock. And so anybody who would like to do that can sign in when I send you an email. So we'll discuss more of that later, but be watching for an email from me sometime later today. As we continue our thoughts at Mark chapter 13, the question that I think many people ask about why Mark 13 at this particular time. Well, of course, those of our congregation know that I am going through the journey of Jesus through the book of Mark, and we have been looking at this for several months now, leading up to Easter Sunday, leading up to the events surrounding the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And so this is a continuation of that story. And as I shared with you earlier in the week and gave you a little bit of an overview from Mark chapter 11 through Mark chapter 13, Jesus has entered into Jerusalem in Mark's story. One of the reasons why I think it's good to talk about this particular chapter at this time, Mark chapter 13 talks a lot about judgment. It talks about end of the world type of language, and certainly we're hearing some of that kind of language come out in our current crisis. Well, despite the fact that it is where we are in our series of lessons, the Olivet prophecy of Jesus on the Mount of Olives in Mark chapter 13 was written in an end-of-the-world context for Jesus' followers and disciples. The recipients of Mark's letter were living around the mid-60s AD. And during that particular time, things were getting pretty difficult and pretty bad for those who were Jewish and those who were in the area of Jerusalem especially. And they were facing some very unreal events that were occurring, and it was going to be a disaster of major proportions in the coming future. And so Jesus is discussing in private with his apostles about these things. And he talks about the complete destruction of the city and the destruction of the Holy Temple. If we zoom forward to the time that Mark's readers are reading this particular gospel, it would again be about the mid-60s, and several events have occurred that resulted in the Roman military takeover and the collapse of the Jewish state, of the nation of Israel. It was precipitated by the divisive policies of Roman occupiers that antagonize the Jews. The Jews set up a revolutionary government and increased insurgent attacks upon the Roman garrisons, the Herod's palace, and other Roman forces. In the spring of 67 AD, the Roman general Vespasian and his son Titus set up garrisons and military camps throughout the region to maintain control of the Jews. However, political turmoil in Rome delayed that attack. Nero had died, and so they went through a succession of about 3 emperors, one after the other, over a period of about 2 years, until they called Vespasian and gave him the title of Roman emperor. Well, Vespasian then left the Palestine area, went back to Rome, leaving Titus, his general, in charge of taking Jerusalem. During that 2-year siege, a disastrous civil war broke out among the Jews within the walls of Jerusalem. Extremists and moderates were expressing their views and polarizing to each other as they turned on each other during this very stressful time. Eventually, there were 3 factions that arose within the walls of Jerusalem, which made the fall of Jerusalem somewhat easy for the Romans because the kingdom of Israel was greatly divided. In the spring of 70 AD, Titus finally moved his troops into the city, and he prevented provisions from entering in or out of the city, thus starving the inhabitants. In July of 70 AD, Timothy finally broke through the walls, and he plundered the temple. He offered sacrifices, erected an idol of perhaps Zeus in the temple area, and then he burned the city and the temple and destroyed it all. The defeat of the Jewish Revolt altered the Jewish demographics at that time, as many were scattered throughout the Mediterranean area. It says in the historian Josephus that nearly 100,000 were sold into slavery, and over 1 million people died either by sword or by illness or starvation. The defeat of the Jewish Revolt altered Jewish demographics again drastically. And so many people were oppressed, and it was just a very, very bad time. And as we think about that time, many of the disciples of Christ who Paul had written to and the letter had been addressed to were going through some very difficult and challenging experiences. They were suffering. It was very imperative for them to retell the gospel story of Jesus as they grappled with the end of the world as they knew it. They needed hope. They needed to know who was truly in charge as they faced the hole in the world. Do you remember the Eagles song, Hole in the World? The song was written in response to 9/11, to the 9/11 attacks, and it was released in 2003. The refrain of that song was, "There's a hole in the world tonight. There's a cloud of fear and sorrow. There's a hole in the world tonight. Don't let there be a hole in the world tomorrow." Mark narrates the story of Jesus that had happened some 30 years before the cloud of fear and sorrow had engulfed the city. He tells of the private conversation between Jesus and a few of his apostles. They sought to understand what Jesus meant when he declared that Jerusalem was going to be marked for destruction. One reason why I wanted to film outside today again is I wanted you to see this tree behind me. It's a very unique tree. If you notice the orange dots and the orange X's that are on that tree, in our communities, what does that mean about that tree? Well, in our neighborhoods, we have had several old trees that have been marked for destruction, and they would put an X or a dot on the tree. Sometimes the tree is very healthy, as this one is. It's just that the limbs and the branches pose a threat and are dangerous. But some of the trees are dead and they need to come down. And so they mark that tree with a dot or an X. Well, so much was the case for those that were in Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been marked by God. It was time for them to be destroyed. And so Jesus tells his apostles, Jerusalem, the temple, it's marked. It's ready to be cut down. They are ready to be destroyed. Yet Jesus doesn't say that in a way that is eager. He says it in a way that is compassionate, and he anguishes over the thought of the royal city, the city that was devoted to him, would be destroyed. The temple that was to be his place or his presence was going to be torn down. In Matthew's account of this same correspondence, Matthew writes these words, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones God's messengers. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks beneath her wings, but you wouldn't let me. And now, look, your house is left abandoned and desolate. For I tell you this, you will never see me again until you say, blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. So have no doubt, Jesus cared for the city and he cared for the temple. Have no doubt, Jesus cares about the church that was living out these perilous times when Mark had written this letter. And as they read the story of Jesus and the story of the gospel, it reminded them who they were. They were his disciples, and they too were living in a time of peril and of destruction. Jesus' words to that generation, as I mentioned to you in the previous video, were these, and I'll just make these really short. Don't panic. Don't believe everything you hear, because no one knows the time. Watch out, pay attention, be on your guard. You're going to be hated. Sin's going to be rampant. Love will grow cold. There will be great anguish. And if you have opportunity, flee to the hills. Get out of the city. This will be your opportunity, Jesus also says, to tell the good news in the gospel about me. Don't worry about what you're going to say. God says he will guide you and he will give you the Spirit. But it gives you an opportunity to share about who Jesus is in that day and age. And he encourages them to have hope. God will shorten this perilous time because he loves you and he wants you to be protective. And finally, he tells them, endure to the end. Endure, be faithful. Keep hold of your faith in the midst of these perilous and difficult times. Well, I think we can see the obvious lessons for us today. We've seen a lot that can change in a matter of a couple of weeks. COVID-19 has a contagion time frame of 2 weeks. So as the New York governor recently stated, despite our best efforts, the spike in outbreaks will rise. The hope is that our societal shutdown will flatten that curve. It is good to know, as also the New York governor said, that 80% of the COVID patients have no need of hospitalization and will recover. 80%, that's good, that's hopeful. However, our most vulnerable will experience the heavy toll and are experiencing the heaviest toll. Globally, we know about China, we know about Italy. Suzanne told me this week about the tragedy unfolding in Malawi, where there is one doctor and one nurse for 18,000 people. Truly, it is our generation's first pandemic. Truly, as the song says, there's a hole in the world. There's a hole in the world. So in the time of outbreak, in the times of isolation, in times of sickness, the questions are, will we be scared? Certainly. Certainly. Will we be anxious? You bet. Anxiety, being afraid, that's all a part of a world of sorrow, a world of fear. And I think that it's probably a little irresponsible for us to say that, oh, as Christians, we're not afraid of anything. You know, if we die, we're going to go to heaven and so forth. I believe that. I believe every bit of that. But I think when people are afraid and anxious, they need comfort. They need comfort and they need hope and they need love. And so let's not add to the fears. Let's not add to the anxieties, but let's be there as a calm presence in the world. So how should we then live? I think we live by the words of Jesus at this time. First of all, again, don't panic. The fear of the unknown and the anxiety about what we know and don't know are weighing us down. Experts are telling us to use our fear to take drastic actions that are needed for the good of the most vulnerable among us. So let's take those drastic actions, but don't panic. Jesus also says to trust God. God is worthy of our trust, don't you think? We have every reason to have hope. Even if this is the end of the world as we know it, God is holding you in the palm of his hand. So take a deep breath. Be still and focus on this great fact of trusting God. Third, I think Jesus says for us to keep faith. Keep faith. In the atmosphere of fear and anxiety, God calls us to faith, peace, and hope. From this place of hope, God calls us to keep awake, to keep alert. We are to do the work of the kingdom and amid the chaos, spreading the love of God and the gospel of God as best we can. As we battle the COVID-19 epidemic with radical public health measures, can we battle the pandemic of fear with a counter-pandemic of hope? And finally, Jesus says, face fear with love. When I live in fear, I turn inward and I worry about myself. When I live in love, I turn outward and I seek to understand. I seek to empathize. I seek to care for others. The greatest is still love. So the opposite of fear is love. You see, love motivates us to check on our neighbor. Love prompts us to share our toilet paper and our food. Love reconnects through Zoom or FaceTime or phone call. Love sews a mask for the hospital. Love can do an awful lot of things. Because Debbie works in the public at the post office, we have decided to self-quarantine from our grandchildren. That's been a very difficult thing to do. But we can't stand not seeing them. So we've made an arrangement that we go and we bring them the school lunches that are given by the schools. And we go to their house and get to see them through the living room window. Our little guy, Landon, is so excited to see us. He jumps around and he laughs. As a 3-year-old, he doesn't quite understand why Pap doesn't come inside to play, but his mommy has told him we need to keep the germs away for a while. Well, yesterday, he had had enough of it. When I came by, he cried as he came to the window. He wanted to come outside with Pap. As tears rolled down his cheek, I reassured him that Pap loved him and we would soon be able to go for a ride and play together. And through those sobs and the tears, he simply said, as he often says, I love you, Pap. Well, I love you guys. The beauty of the kingdom of God is that in times like these, we can truly live like Jesus and share him with the world. So may God bless you with hope, with faith, and with love in these times.